All right, I think we can start. Hello, all. I'm Aditya Tsunekar from Prayas Energy Group. Welcome to this webinar, More with Less. And taking a cue from the title, I'll keep my introductory remarks very less and let my colleague Ashok do all the talking, who has a bunch of interesting insights from a bottom up modeling of India's residential energy demand. So we usually talk about, or at least the policy discourse is about low levels of India's per capita energy consumption and how it is expected to grow substantially to meet our developmental goals. However, it is critical to go beyond a simple extrapolation of past trends or comparison with other countries and do a bottom up assessment to estimate the quantum of this growth. And this involves looking at factors like ownership of appliances, usage, energy efficiency, and others. And such an assessment is very critical and it can positively inform our policies of managing that demand, the future demand, in a sustainable manner. So that's the key objective of our modeling effort and also the focus of this webinar. Now, Mr. Vishal Kapoor, CEO of EESL, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, had agreed to give opening remarks today. EESL has been pioneer of market transformation programs such as that for LED bulbs and now for ceiling fans, air conditioners, electric vehicles, and more. It would have been great to hear from him, but unfortunately, he cannot join due to some unavoidable last minute changes in his schedule. So we will directly move to the webinar presentation by my colleague Ashok. A few announcements before that. Uh, Please type your questions in the Q&A window located on the bottom panel of your screen. Please also mention the slide number where applicable. Srihari and Naren, my colleagues will try to answer some of the questions online, particularly those which are more specific in nature. We'll discuss questions of broader nature during the Q&A session, which will be after the presentation. And we'll collate questions of a similar nature and take them up together in interest of time. So that's more or less to it. And over to you, Ashok, for your presentation.
Thanks, Aditya, for that introduction. As Aditya said, it's really unfortunate that Mr. Kapoor could not join us today for share his own thoughts about some of the work that ESL is doing and things like that. But we will try and anyway share the results that we have and the insights that we have from our modeling exercise with you, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. I'll just begin by sharing my screen and we'll take it from there. Yeah. I hope you all can see my screen and you can see the slide that's being projected. So as Aditya said, the title of the talk today is called More with Less. And as the title suggests, what we're trying to look at is essentially how India's residential energy demand can or will grow in the future while meeting developmental aspirations of the people of the country. So I'll just begin by giving a very quick overview of what this talk will look like and why we are doing this work and so on. In case you hear some background noise, apologies. It's all part of India's growth story. We are having like a lot of construction activities going on around here, and that might lead to some disturbances, but we have tried to minimize them, and I hope you are able to hear me clearly. So the first question is, why are we even looking at residential energy? And essentially, the reason for that is, as Aditya mentioned in his opening remarks, we as a country have some way to go in terms of achieving good quality of life for most of our citizens. There is a lot of aspirations that people have in terms of achieving a good quality of life. And we also have had supporting programs in terms of improving residential energy access over the last decade or more in the form of earlier RGGVY and then Saubhagya to increase electrification. And then we had the PM Ujjwala Yojana to take LPG access to most households in the country and so on. So all these have also, of course, been in some sense game changers and non-linear step functions in terms of how Indian households use energy. And finally, there is, of course, the question of changing weather patterns. Fortunately, today in Pune, it has been behaving like a normal monsoon day and rains have been there. But as you all know, we had a very dry August, which has led to unexpected increases in demand. And these changing weather patterns, of course, will also lead to changing energy consumption, as we all know. So these are some of the reasons why we thought it's important to look at residential energy demand. Now, very quickly to talk about PIER, the model that we have used to do this work. It's essentially an open data model built on an open source platform called Rumi, which essentially means that all the data, the input assumptions, the outputs, everything will be made public. And the modeling platform, that is the code on which this data was run, which is a platform called Rumi, will also be made public. All of these will be made public in a few months. As you might have noticed on the title slide that I shared with you, this is version 1.5 of PIER. So it's essentially somewhere in between 1.0 and 2.0. We are hoping that soon we'll come out with version 2.0, and at that point, we'll put out all the code and the data associated with this model. PIER is a detailed bottom-up model. What we mean by that, I'll come to that in the next few slides to explain that in greater detail. And it allows us to estimate energy demand at different levels of disaggregation, both geographic as well as temporal disaggregation. And finally, as with many modeling exercises, the hope is that this exercise will give us useful inputs into policy formulation and so on. So just to tell you about how the talk itself is going to be structured today, I will, like Aditya said, also not take up too much time so that we have more time for discussion and Q&A. So in the interest of that, I will not spend too much time on the model setup part itself. I will very quickly run through how we have tried to build the model, but focus more on the model results and the insights that emerge from the modeling exercise. And again, for the in the interest of time, I'll only be presenting results which are at the national level as part of this presentation, though we do have state level disaggregation also, as we will see soon. And we can discuss some of that also if time permits during the discussion session. So to quickly talk about the modeling setup. Uh, so essentially, as it says on the right-hand side, we have modeled all the normal fuels or energy sources that you would expect to be used in households. Electricity and all the cooking fuels of interest have been modeled. The time period for which we have modeled, and the model gives us projections, is financial year 2024, that is 2023-2024, all the way up to financial year 2041. And the way we have broken up time and model time in the within PIER is each year has been broken up into 5 typical seasons, where each season essentially consists of either 2 months or 3 months, depending on which season it is. And each season is modeled as one typical day by one typical day, and that typical day is further broken down into 24 hours. In addition, geographically, we have broken India down into a state level, which does not correspond exactly to the geographic state division in India, but more or less gives us equivalent state level disaggregation. And using these inputs, this is how essentially we compute bottom-up energy demand within PIER. So essentially, I would say that there are 4 major inputs which are listed on the slide there. The number of households, basically demographic information, which is obviously the most fundamental thing that you need for any such exercise. Then we also look in detail at the energy services that these households demand. What are the kinds of things that households need in terms of energy services? Then we talk about household penetration of different appliances that provide these energy services. And finally, the specific energy consumption or its converse, that is energy efficiency of these appliances, so that we can convert this energy service demand into energy demand. So this is fundamentally the approach that we take within PIER. And what are the energy services that we have modeled? I'm not going to spend much time on this. We can come back to this if required, but basically, we have modeled 5 energy services that you can see here: lighting, space cooling, refrigeration, cooking, and television watching. And each of these services is provided by various technologies. So for example, refrigeration is provided by either direct cool refrigerators or frost-free refrigerators, and TV watching is provided through flat screen TVs. And each of these technologies, where possible, we have also modeled different efficiency levels. So for example, if you look at refrigerators and air conditioners, we have modeled 3 different efficiency levels. ACs are modeled as 3, 4, 5-star ACs, and refrigerators are modeled as 2, 3, 4-star refrigerators. Uh, and the energy service demanded depends on the particular energy service we're talking about. So, for example, lighting is only a few hours in the evening, and typically, and in the monsoons and winter mornings, maybe an hour. And similarly, for space cooling, the way we estimate the amount of cooling required isn't based on temperature projections that we have going all the way up to 2041, and something called as a trigger temperature, which tells you at what temperature do you switch on a fan or do you switch on an AC. Essentially, this tells you how much energy service you need. One last thing that I want to highlight here is because India has effectively achieved universal electrification now, we assume that all households use electric lighting, while other appliances, not all households may be using, and only some households may be using. Of course, these are not the only services that are used within households. So there are also a set of unmodeled energy services. So, for example, some households may use washing machines, some households may have electric water heaters or gas-based water heaters or whatever. So these services are the energy demanded by these services is estimated exogenously based on calibration against FY21 data. So bottom-up estimates of the energy demand from the other services for FY21 are compared against actual energy demanded by households from official data put out by the Central Electricity Authority, and based on that, it's calibrated. And we find that at a national level, the bottom-up model services account for about 80% of the demand, and 20% is modeled exogenously for these other services. Though, of course, one must remember that there are state-level differences that do arise. Now coming to household penetration of appliances. Essentially, as I said, we have split India into states, and we have 25 states within the model. Some of the smaller states have been combined and so on. We can go into the details if required. And each state has been further split into urban and rural households. So essentially, India is represented by 50 different types of households, 25 states, each with an urban and rural component. And for each of these household types, appliance penetrations are estimated. That is, we have used the latest available data, which is in the form of NFHS 5 of ownership of appliances, which we saw on the previous slide for the different energy services. So whether they are fans or air conditioners or refrigerators or other such appliances, televisions, we take from NFHS 5 and project them forward. And the projection is essentially based on looking at what the penetration was in NFHS 4, which was done 4 years prior, and NFHS 5, and projecting it forward using some other functions such as the GSDP of elasticity of penetration to per capita GSDP and so on, and adjusting some extreme values, because we do find that between these 2 years, some values are very high or very low, and those are adjusted to bring them back to somewhat more normal values. Finally, talking about specific energy consumption, essentially the way we look at it is that there is a certain the existing stock of appliances at the beginning of the model period is assumed to have a certain efficiency. And going forward, each new appliance that is purchased by households their efficiency is modeled based roughly on how BE notifies its standards of efficiency. So especially for all the appliances that have mandatory efficiency standards, namely ACs, refrigerators, TVs, and fans, which covers most of the appliances that we model. And at any particular year, let's say you're talking about the efficiency of televisions in 2035, essentially the efficiency of appliances bought in 2035 weighted with the efficiency of the pre-existing stock of 2034 will give you the specific energy consumption of the stock of TVs in 2035. So this is how we calculate specific energy consumption. Finally, a quick look at the scenarios that we have modeled as part of this exercise. Essentially, the 3 parameters that we felt are most critical to deciding the energy demand are the specific energy consumption, the appliance ownership penetration, how many households are owning it, and how they are using the appliances. So these three parameters are varied to come up with 5 different scenarios. The first one is what is called as the likely efficiency trend or the likely trend, which is somewhat like the reference scenario, in which efficiency standards are, we pretty much follow the BEE process, where efficiency standards are revised every 4 years for all appliances, except for fans, because fans have come under the mandatory efficiency standard only very recently. So for them, we revise it once in 6 years. And we assume that the actual efficiency when you use an appliance at home is 60% of what it is as notified by BE. The reason we do that is because we all know that at actual usage time, anyway, you're not going to get the lab tested efficiency that's notified by BE, which is fine. But unfortunately, we don't have any better data about this. And anecdotal evidence and sketchy evidence points to it's being somewhere in that range of 60 to 65%. So that's why we thought that we'll use 60% as the actual appliance efficiency. In addition, we also model over the years people buying of the share of appliances bought, the higher star rated appliances share gradually increases. And in terms of ownership, in the LET scenario, we have standard ownership. And in terms of usage, also it is standard. When I say standard, it essentially means that we're talking about as expected with the number of hours of usage and so on, the temperature at which appliances are turned on and so on and so forth. When it comes to the desired efficiency standard, essentially, as the name suggests, here the efficiencies are a little tighter. All appliances, including fans, their efficiency standards are revised once in 4 years. And actual appliance efficiency in the market is 80% of what is notified rather than 60% in the LET. And the shift to higher star rated appliances somewhat faster than in the LET. Other things remain the same. So in each of these, other than LET, the next 3 scenarios, DET, high ownership, and high usage, we change one of those 3 parameters. So DET, we say efficiency improves faster than in the reference. In high ownership, we say that usage and efficiency remain same as the likely efficiency trend, but number of appliances owned is somewhat greater. In high usage, we say that efficiency and ownership remain same as likely trend, but appliances get used more. For example, in the case of cooling, they get used 2 degrees centigrade earlier. And high consumption, which is essentially a combination of both high ownership and high usage, and where efficiency does not improve as fast as desired efficiency trend. So it's likely efficiency trend, high ownership, and high usage that together form high consumption. So we thought that these 5 scenarios together kind of give a good envelope of possibilities for future demand. And this is what we have modeled. Now let's look at what this essentially implies for India as a country. First thing is, under these assumptions, what happens to appliance ownership? So essentially what happens is that, as we saw in the beginning, lighting anyway, even in FY24, all households are assumed to use electricity for lighting. By FY41, all households own fans. In fact, I think all households start owning fans by 38 or 39. I don't remember the exact year. And almost all households own TVs, which is, I think, 99.6% or 99.5% households own TVs by FY41 in all scenarios, even in the standard ownership or high ownership. The interesting thing is to look at ACs, which is an appliance that would perhaps be most of interest to all of us. Here we see that AC penetration, which in FY24 is around 9% in India, increases to, depending on the standard ownership, it increases to 51%. And in the high ownership case, it increases to 63%. This is what you see in the chart here. This is the percentage of households owning ACs. So across scenarios, you see that there's a big increase. Even in the likely efficiency trend or the standard ownership of ACs, you see that it increases at whopping 12% per annum CAGR is the percentage growth of households owning ACs. Remember, in the meantime, households themselves are also growing. The number of households are also growing. So this is a percentage of households owning, which is itself is growing at 12% per year. Even rural India, whose AC penetration is only 2.5% or so in FY24, increases to anywhere between about 1/3, 34, 35% in the standard case, and in the high ownership case, almost half the households in rural India also own ACs by FY2041. If you look at refrigerators, which is the other appliance of interest, you will see that almost 80% or more than 80% of India owns refrigerators by FY2041 across all scenarios. So essentially what we are saying is that it's not that this model does not meet Indian citizens' aspirations. There's a healthy growth in ownership of appliances and therefore their usage across all scenarios. And that's why we say that the model does reflect significant welfare increase if one could equate welfare to owning and using appliances by FY 2041. So now let's quickly jump into what are the results of the model, what do the results of the model look like. So as one would expect, the results show that the high consumption scenario, which is HC, is the one that has the greatest demand. The likely efficiency trend scenario is somewhere in the middle, and the desired efficiency trend, which has got higher efficiency than LET, is obviously has the least energy demand. And that is seen in these graphs. The first graph is LET, then you have DET, then high ownership, high usage, and high consumption. So just to look at these numbers, maybe these numbers themselves may or may not mean too much, but it is 375 billion units or terawatt hours of residential electricity demand for DET in FY24, 413 for LET and 473 for BU. And the gap between these three, as you can see from the chart and from these numbers, grows by FY 2041. So in DET, it grows from 375 to 572 across these years, while in LET, it grows from 413 to 715, and 473 becomes 878, which you can see reflected here. And the different colored segments of these bars are the different appliances. So the bottom three represent fans, ACs, and refrigerators respectively, while the top represents all the other demand within residential within residences in India. And you can see that essentially fans, ACs, and refrigerators together represent more than 2/3 of the total share. In fact, often it goes well above 70% also. So essentially, if you're talking about determinants of energy demand, perhaps one could say that these are the three appliances that by and large determine Indian residential electricity demand. Carrying on from there, as we saw, it not only fans, ACs, and refrigerators. In particular, if you look at space cooling, which is essentially fans, ACs, and also some amount of demand from space air coolers, they themselves contribute to 60 to 70% of residential electricity demand across the years in all the scenarios. Even more interestingly, what we found was that if you look at the total increase in residential electricity demand from 2024 to 2041, for example, in LET, the orange bars here show that how much the different electricity demand increased from 24 to 41 in each of these scenarios. You can see that a huge chunk of it is due to ACs. The blue bars represent the increase in AC demand over the same period across the scenario. So as this line is trying to show here, anywhere between about 80 to 85% of the total demand increase across the years is purely caused due to air conditioners. The next result that I just want to quickly run through is to look at, so far the first two results we saw was focused on electricity. Now I just want to talk a little bit about total energy. So not just electricity, but more all of residential energy. And something that is perhaps not very apparent to everybody is that actually electricity plays a not very big role even within households in terms of energy demand. The biggest consumer, if you look at energy services, the energy service that consumes the most energy in households is actually cooking. And uh, as a result of Indian households moving away from biomass to more modern cooking fuels, one actually has this very interesting phenomenon of total energy demand in Indian households actually decreasing over time. It actually goes down in the LET scenario from 5,450 petajoules, about that in 2024. It goes down to 4,650 petajoules in 2041, in spite of both the number of households increasing and the number of appliance ownership increasing and so on, simply because solid fuel or biomass-based cooking is extremely inefficient. And as people shift to more modern fuels, you actually end consuming much less primary energy than you need. So as you can see in the second chart, which is actually the first chart is showing you energy services and demand by energy service. The second one is showing you by energy carrier. So here you can see that biomass is occupying more about half or thereabouts in FY24, which is the blue part of the bar. By FY 2041, its share is reduced significantly and electricity share has gone up significantly within households. So based on these results, now I want to just spend the next few minutes to focus on some of the interesting insights that we have from this modeling exercise. So the first one is that, as we saw right in the beginning, there is actually significant increase in so-called welfare of Indian households in the form of appliance ownership. So what this chart is plotting is in 2024, it basically normalizes these four different values: the number of households that own air conditioners, number of households owning refrigerators, total residential electricity demand, and per household residential electricity demand, all of them to a value of 100, and see how it changes by 2041. And what you see is that number of air conditioner owning households increases by about 7.5 times. That is, the value of 100 becomes about 730 or 740. Similarly, the number of households owning refrigerators goes from 100 to 230 odd, so 2.3x increase in households with refrigerators. But total electricity demand only increases by 73%. That 100 becomes 173. And because, of course, in the meantime, as I said, number of households have also increased, the total per household electricity demand only increases by 31%. So 100 only becomes 131. So the really interesting thing that comes out of this is that increasing appliance use doesn't necessarily mean commensurate increase in electricity demand. And therefore, as Aditya pointed out in the beginning, uh, estimating future demand purely based on past trends is risky, because there might have been some uh, kind of disruptive elements in the recent past which might have caused demand to grow in a certain way, which may not necessarily hold in the future. Of course, the disruptive elements could be in the future also, which might cause a otherwise growing trend to not grow as fast. So this is one interesting insight that we thought this modeling exercise shows us. The second one is in terms of understanding what are the major determinants of the electricity demand among the, let's say, parameters that we looked at: efficiency, ownership, usage, and so on. So as we kind of try to talk about in the last slide also, the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate of electricity demand, is only 3.3% in the most likely scenario as per this model between FY24 and FY41. This value, the only, is in double quotes because, as you many of you might know, in the recent past, residential electricity demand has actually been growing at a significantly greater rate. Note that even though the overall demand only grows at 3.3%, commensurate to the electricity ownership, AC ownership growing at about 12%, if I remember right, you see that the electricity demand for ACs is actually growing very fast. It is growing at more than 10%. But the overall demand only grows at 3.3%. And as you would expect in the DET scenario, when efficiency is even greater, the CAGR of demand drops to just 2.5%, without any change in the number of households owning and using ACs at all, ACs or other appliances. Indeed, even in the high consumption scenario where efficiency does not grow as fast and ownership and usage are greater than even in the normal scenario, it only grows at 3.7% between FY24 and FY41. So this chart is essentially showing what are the different components? How does ownership, usage, and efficiency contribute to this change in demand? So they are plotting the difference between the residential electricity demand in 2041 in the LET scenario and these three scenarios: DET, HO, and HU. DET, of course, is less than LET. That's why you have a negative value of about 150. And as you can clearly see, this value that you see here is much greater than the increase due to high usage or high ownership. So essentially, that's what we are saying, that energy efficiency is the greatest determinant, and therefore an effective energy efficiency regime actually can play a very vital role in uh, shaping future demand in Indian households. The next one that I'll quickly run through is in terms of residential load shapes. So as I said earlier, in PIER, one has the facility of actually predicting demand, especially of carriers such as electricity on an hourly basis. Therefore, one can get a good estimate of load shapes of this demand, not just total energy requirement. And as you can see, this is in the LET scenario. The peak load of the residential energy services required, not surprisingly occurring on summer evenings when ACs and even induction cooking, as we go into the future, play a big role in determining this peak evening demand. That goes from more than doubles from 81 gigawatts to 175 gigawatts. If you remember from the earlier slide, we saw that the overall demand only grows by about 73%. 100 had become 173. So this is growing faster than that, which means that essentially your load shape is getting peakier. The peaks, peak to average and peak to trough ratios are increasing over time. So this is another interesting observation and something that leads us to conclude that going forward, the importance of power procurement to meet these peak load demands, as well as the importance of network planning and the importance of demand side management strategies to manage this peak load, all of these will gain importance and we need to start paying more attention to them. The next insight is in terms of comparing behavior versus ownership. So the interesting thing here that we found was this chart. Essentially, what it is showing is in 2041, again in the LET scenario, the reference or normal scenario, what are the number of ACs that are owned by households, and in the two cases, one is in the high ownership case and in the high usage case. In the high ownership case, obviously, you will have more of these appliances. As it says here, there are about 60 million more ACs and 25 million more refrigerators and fans in FY41 in the high ownership case as compared to the normal or high usage case. But if you look at the total electricity demand in 2041, you see that the terawatt hours of energy required in the high usage case is slightly more than in the high ownership case. In other words, despite so many more extra appliances being present in high ownership, the fact that people are using those appliances a little more, using fewer appliances but using them more, actually leads to a greater demand. So this is again gives us the interesting insight that policies or other measures that can target incentives and messages and so on, that can target user behavior of how people use appliances, can be actually a very useful lever to manage demand. In addition to, of course, efficiency, which we saw earlier was a big driver. And one need not be as worried about people owning appliances as how people use appliances. The last insight that I want to share with you before I wind up is about cooking energy. Uh, as we saw earlier, the usage of modern cooking fuels rapidly increases, and that's what this chart is trying to show. The penetration of different cooking fuels, biomass penetration, which is the bottommost color in the bar here, reduces significantly, and the gray one is LPG, which increases a lot. Its penetration goes from 65 to 82%, and modern cooking fuels in general increase from 68% in FY24 to 94% in FY41. And induction-based electricity grows very fast. The topmost blue band that you see here goes from 0.5% of households in 2024 to as much as 7.6% in FY41. However, the somewhat dark lining to the silver cloud, if I may call it, is that 6% of India in 2041 still represents 27 million households. So even in FY41, our projections show that 27 million households will still be using solid fuels. And all of this are in rural areas of 7 particular states in India, indicating the need for a targeted intervention in these states, even though as a nation, we do make good progress towards clean cooking fuel by that time. So to conclude, I will just say that this exercise gave us useful policy insights about demand estimation, about the role of efficiency, about the role of how behavior can influence demand, and about the kind of challenges that might arise in future regarding promoting clean cooking use, or the need to promote clean cooking use, or the need to manage peak load as it occurs in residential energy. And finally, the next plans that we have with PIER, as I said, we have this is 1.5, and we're in the process of building PIER 2.0, in which we are going to improve the temporal and geographic disaggregation that we have to make it better in some form. We are also using better temperature projections so that we hopefully get even more accurate or better projections of demand. And in addition to residential sector, we are modeling other sectors such as transport and industry to get a better understanding of overall energy demand in the country. And since we are looking to 2041 as the horizon year, we of course are looking at newer technologies that will be effective by then, and newer kind of fuels such as hydrogen and so on that are likely to be prevalent by then. So we'll be introducing all of them as we go forward. So with that, I'll conclude, and this is the report that we have, the paper that we have published, which has all these details, and we'll be happy to discuss more with you. So back to you, Aditya. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ashok, for the presentation. And there are already quite a few questions on the Q&A box, and Naren and Srihari have replied to some of them. What I'll do is I'll club around 2 or 3 questions, and then you can answer them in those sets. Yeah, and the first set of questions is definitely around air conditioners, because that seems to be the most important thing in the residential demand. And 3 questions, as in multiple questions, but around those 3 themes. First is, in our model, we have considered temperature as a trigger to AC usage, but humidity is also an important factor, and in fact, equally important as temperature. So what do we do about it, and what is our perception on how it will be used? Question number one. Question number two is, have we also used changing weather patterns in accounting for the change in AC usage going further? So that's question two. And question three is about the rebound effect, wherein increasing the efficiency of an appliance would increase the use of that appliance. So those are three set of questions. And just to give you a breather, maybe what I can do is I'll start with rebound, and I'll give some of my views on that, and then you can take the other two. So on the rebound effect, I think it's particularly important in case of, so the rebound question was for all the end users and not only for AC, but I think it is particularly important in case of air conditioners, because for all the other end users, the potential for rebound is very less. As in, for example, in case of TV, just because a TV is more efficient, you're not going to end up watching more TV. But in case of ACs, as of now, there is a limited usage. People do constrain their usage of AC because of the bills, and it might have a substantial impact. But in Indian context, there are very limited studies on what the quantum of that rebound effect would be. In international cases and or in other countries and in household scenario, in ACs, the rebound effect has found around 20 or 30%. But coming back to the model, I don't think we have modeled the rebound effect per se. But again, that's the beauty of making it open, so people can factor in that rebound effect, and the results can be refined. So over to you, Ashok, on humidity and changing weather patterns.
Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Before I get on to that, just to quickly add to what Aditya said about rebound effect also, I think studying rebound effect in the Indian context, for one thing, as Aditya said, yes, in the current model of PIER, we have not explicitly modeled rebound effect, and that is something that we do. I would say that modeling rebound effect, in a sense, the larger question related to that is it's related to modeling price elasticity of demand. The rebound effect partially comes from that, and that is something that we hope to move in that direction as we go forward. That is something that we will do. And also in the Indian context, I think rebound effect is a slightly requires a deeper thinking, because it's also informed by, let's say, things like tariff design, because just because it's not only simply the number of units that you're consuming, but how your tariff is constructed around that, and how big a part that is in your overall expenditure basket, which will also determine rebound. So as Aditya said, this definitely requires more study, and we need to do more research on this. Coming to the other two questions, I think that's a good question. We are completely aware that humidity is also a big determinant of AC usage. I would say that today we have done a kind of a crude way of accounting for humidity by very broadly considering some states. Essentially, that trigger temperature that I talked about, at the temperature at which you switch on an appliance, we have tweaked it across different states to roughly reflect the differences in humidity across them. But obviously, this is a very crude approximation, and it would be good to actually bring in humidity as also as an explicit parameter in modeling this demand. And as Aditya said, that's really why we want to make this open source and open data, so that people can building these models. We are not really experts in some of these things, and we hope that other people who are better equipped and better aware of these kinds of techniques can take this model, build in those things, and get better estimates. In terms of weather patterns, what we have done is essentially taken the latest, well, not the latest we will be upgrading to very soon, but the temperature projections as put out by the IPCC people in terms of the best available research on likely temperature projections across the globe over the next 100 years or thereabouts, at a fairly fine geographic granularity. I do not remember the exact granularity now, but it's a fairly fine granularity. And that's what we use to actually build our temperature projections to do this. So what we have modeled is what let's say climate scientists think are the most likely temperature patterns that are going to be. But I agree that as we all are seeing increasingly unpredictable and variable weather, it would be good to model that. And we have not done that. Perhaps we could think of doing some scenarios around that ourselves. But once again, everybody is welcome to build their own scenarios to add these kinds of parameters to and come up with their own answers to it, and we'll be more than happy to see those results. Yeah, back to you, Aditya.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of more or a set of questions on again AC use, or let's say not AC use, but space cooling use. So I think one of the questions was, uh, have we modeled air cooler? So that is one. Second is someone also asked a question about, or rather a comment on, do we include anything on building design and how it impacts the space cooling needs. A third question was on, have you considered a resale market, because uh, uh, people do tend to use appliances more and then they also get passed on to secondary markets. So those were, maybe you can take these three questions as I sort through the unanswered questions.
Yeah, sure. Uh, Tough questions. Air coolers is easy actually. No, we have modeled air coolers, though they do form a fairly small part of the overall basket of in the both in the terms of the number of appliances and therefore the amount of demand arising from usage of air coolers. Again, the one challenge with air coolers, which I'm happy to share here, is that unfortunately, most of the surveys that we have conducted in India, whether it is the NSSO surveys or NFHS surveys, they club air conditioners and air coolers. There's a single question asked whether you own an air conditioner or an air cooler. So untangling air conditioners and air coolers was a bit of a challenge. I'm happy to share the gory details of how we have done it, but we had to make some assumptions and use some other data sources to try and untangle it and so on. We have done that. Uh, and using that, we have modeled air coolers. Building materials, no, that is a important thing, but this particular model does not look at that because we are looking at national level model disaggregated at state level. So, and we had already many parameters to play with. One could potentially think of course, introducing that, except that one would then need to have data about number of houses with different kinds of material and different kinds of uh, whatever, let's say temperature characteristics or so on and so forth. Currently, we have assumed, made a default assumption about what kind of room sizes, what kind of wall material we are going to have, the thermal conductivity of walls and so on. We made some standard assumptions and done these projections in the with the assumption that on an average these are going to work out. These will not give us very fine grained separation, but of course if you are somebody who's going to work on housing policy or something like that, then I understand that that kind of separation has value to it and that kind of model needs to be built. And the good thing is the Rumi platform and the PIER architecture allows you to do that. We just haven't done it currently. Secondary markets, again, no, we have not modeled secondary markets explicitly. The way we have modeled appliances is that all of them have a certain lifetime, and that lifetime determines how long the appliance remains in use and when new appliances get purchased. So even if, let's say, a appliance shifts from house A to house B, as long as it's within the same geography of our model, it doesn't really change our model results because we are looking at it at the aggregate level of a state and urban rural. So as long as it stays there, things are fine. But one could discuss and debate whether the lifetimes we have assumed for appliances, how long they remain in use, are valid, or whether we need to extend them because of this life extension that implicitly happens through secondary markets. That is something that we can discuss and tweak as required. Yeah, I hope that answers the questions. Back to you.
Yeah. A couple of questions on what we have not modeled, the end users that we have not modeled, and a related question is also on the peak demand. Point being water heaters. electric vehicles and cooking. So, okay, there are two different questions. One is water heaters we have not modeled, so why? And second is this water heaters, EVs, and water heaters, EVs would impact, and even, sorry, induction cook stove, they would impact the peak demand. So, what would be the contribution of residential peak demand in the system demand, and how that all adds up?
Yeah, so water heaters is an appliance that we did have quite a bit of internal discussion about whether we should model it, and because we do realize that it does, even if it's not a big contributor to energy, it could be a contributor to peak demand and so on. However, unfortunately, we find that data about it is extremely sketchy, so we would have had to make a lot of assumptions that would be very hard to validate. At least that's what we felt, and that's why we have not modeled water heaters explicitly as a bottom-up appliance. But in our overall energy demand estimation, of course, it's included because all the exogenous demand that we give includes all other appliances, including water heaters. Uh, Electric vehicles, actually, this is a good question. I should have mentioned it in my presentation. But as I said, we are modeling transport separately, bottom-up modeling of transport. And even though we understand that many privately owned vehicles, such as two-wheelers and four-wheelers, are going to be mostly charged in households and therefore will add to residential demand. Currently, we are doing the modeling as part of transport because it fits more logically into that. But once the transport modeling is done, we will bring some of that back into residential demand and say that the residential demand will contribute so much to overall demand. Induction cooking, of course, we have included, and uh, again, we have made some assumptions about how induction stoves are going to be used. Those assumptions can be discussed, debated, and modified as required. But we do find that induction does contribute significantly to peak demand, especially in some states. For example, I think Delhi, if I remember right, where induction cook stove penetration in our model grows quite high, I think induction contributes very significantly to peak demand by 2041 in summer evenings. Yeah, so I hope again that answers the question.
Yeah, in fact, if you can elaborate on the last question a little bit, because that was the next set of questions I was going to come to, this whole cooking as an end use. So there have been some questions on why only 94% of clean cooking in 2041, or even on the similar lines, why only 7 or 8% of electric cooking in 2041. So what are our general assumptions on shifting of fuels for cooking, and how do they impact our results?
Yeah, so the way we have projected these, as I said, is even for cooking, the approach we have taken is broadly similar. It's based on the results that we find in NFHS 4 and NFHS 5, what those surveys show about how households are. That those surveys essentially ask the question of the primary cooking fuel used in the household, which we use as a basis to come up with numbers for those 2 years and then project it forward. So the methodology used is the same, and interestingly, of course, it was between NFHS 4 and NFHS 5 roughly that we did have Ujjwala, and that did lead to a huge growth in adoption of LPG as a cooking fuel. But leaving that aside, essentially what we find, and the projections are done, as I said, separately for each of those 50 household types, each of the 25 states, and within each state, the urban and rural type households. So that is something that based on those projections, essentially we find that it comes to about 94%. One could argue that this is being very conservative, but we have taken a certain approach of using the projections in the values in NFHS 4 and NFHS 5 and projecting that forward. And where we find that the growth rates are extremely high. So for example, in some states, maybe it's even 20-25% per year growth rate between NFHS 4 and NFHS 5. And we believe that such a growth rate cannot be sustained. So those growth rates are somewhat dampened as we go forward. And we have done a set of such things which leads us to the number of 94%. But I completely agree that there's nothing sacrosanct about 94%. But we did not, what I definitely we did not want to do was start with a normative assumption saying that India will have 100% clean cooking usage by some year. We just wanted to see where the trends that we have, based on our own best understanding, take us as we go forward. But if somebody wants to do that kind of analysis as to normatively, I want India to use 100% clean cooking by 2035 or 2041 or whatever year it is, one can always do that. And except that in that case, one will have to figure out the trajectory from here to there, how our households going to go there, and is that something that's reasonable or feasible. Coming to the growth of induction cooking, so the way this whole cooking penetration has been modeled is that uh, the first level of modeling is done at the level of only whether the household uses solid fuels or whether it uses what we call as modern cooking fuels. And then the percentage of households using modern cooking fuels are further split into LPG, pipe natural gas, electricity, and biogas. Biogas is a very small component, so we can leave that aside for now. Uh, for LPG and for piped natural gas, for both of them, there are significant government programs or schemes that are running. So LPG, of course, is through Ujjwala and the subsidy scheme and so on and so forth. And piped natural gas, there have been various geographic areas that have been auctioned to different piped natural gas operators or city gas distribution operators who all have been given targets of so many households that they have to supply with piped natural gas by a certain year and so on. So we have tried to approximate all those things to say that based on this, it is possible that pipe natural gas usage will grow in a certain way. And since we have had this big program of introducing LPG, that will give us LPG in a certain way. But at the same time, we also were cognizant of the fact that electricity, with increasing access to electricity, electricity will also pick up in a significant way. So that's why it's not that. So as I think I mentioned in the presentation, even among the modern cooking fuels, it's electricity that actually grows the fastest. In terms of growth rate, it grows much faster than in fact, it grows even faster than air conditioners. Air conditioners, I think, grow at 12 point some percent in terms of the penetration percentages. Induction cooking grows at 14% or something like that. So it's not that induction cooking is not growing. It's just that the base is so small, it's 0.5%. Even if you apply a 14% growth rate, it only reaches 7.6 or 7.8% by 2041. The last thing I want to say there before I stop is that uh, we also realize that there are challenges to induction cooking adoption, which we need to be cognizant of, some of which I think we have referred to in the paper also, is that the network needs to be capable of handling this kind of a load, especially if we're talking of rural India adopting induction cooking. It's not only the peak load problem, but even the very fact that whether the network can handle that kind of load that we have. Uh, at the transformer level, not at the distribution utility level. Even at the transformer level, the number of households, if they all start using induction cooking, do we have transformers that can do that? Household connections are, I think under Saubhagya, they were all given at 1 kilowatt or lower. I don't remember the exact number, but they were all low wattage connections. So if you start now plugging in a 1 kilowatt or higher induction cook stove, that's not likely to work. So there are all these challenges. So given all that, we also did not let it grow even faster, though, as I said, it does grow very fast at 14%. A long-winded answer, but I hope it gives some insights into the
Yeah,
thinking that went
thanks.
behind
Thanks, sir.
this.
So we are 5 minutes away from our closing time, but there are still quite a few questions that people have. We'll try to club as many as possible so that you can answer them. So two set of questions. Maybe we'll take one by one. First is around this whole trigger temperature. I mean, how did we come up with this magical trigger temperature, or what are our assumptions behind that? And then do they also change over time so that the AC usage, does it also change over time? That is the first set of questions. So maybe you can answer.
Okay, I won't take much time over this. Frankly, the trigger temperatures, the basis for trigger temperatures are just assumptions. We just had a discussion among ourselves and within the office as to when do we all turn on our own fans, or when would we like to turn on our ACs, and so on. Uh, so they are based on assumptions, but modified, as I said earlier, slightly to account for humidity and also if I remember right, we have differentiated between urban and rural households. So, for example, rural households have a slightly higher trigger temperature because uh, we assume that on an average, a rural household will probably be a little more tolerant because their perhaps paying capacity is lower, they'll turn on their appliances a little later, while urban households will turn it on earlier. But it's based on an assumption, and once again, open to discussing and modifying those inputs if somebody has better data on that. Over time, we have not modified it because we felt that people's need for when they want to turn on appliance may not change. As temperatures rise, of course, those appliances will get used more often. But when it will get turned on, we have assumed does not change. But again, the model allows you to do that if you want to do that. We haven't done it.
Okay. So the next and probably the last set of questions, if the participants have any more questions, this is your last chance. But the last set of questions that we have, there were a set of interesting questions on modeling the impact of specific policy interventions on demand. So there were questions on, can we use the model uh, to estimate the impact of, let's say, TOD tariffs, how that will change the demand, or even a demand response program, how that will change the demand, or in fact, even the freebies, that increasing freebies, in fact, that was a question by all the political parties. I mean, can you do all this to assess the impact on the residential energy demand?
Uh, Yes, you can in principle, and I will go back to what I said some time back because this is in a way related to what the discussion we had when we were talking about rebound effect. Because fundamentally, that's why I said many of these things come back to how people are going to react to changing prices. So TOD tariffs are essentially going to be either penalizing you or incentivizing you for using appliances at certain times of the day. Similarly, demand response might give you incentives for using something at some time of the day or penalize you at other times of the day. And freebies, of course, are essentially cutting the price down to zero up to some level, and after that, changing things. So fundamentally, if we can, what in principle it's possible. We have not done it in PIER, but in principle, one would have to come up with some kind of a formulation. Mathematical formulation of how prices, these kinds of price changes will affect people's behavior on two counts. One is in terms of their behavior on ownership of appliances, and second is their behavior in terms of usage of appliances. The PIER toolkit itself allows you to do these things. It has a disaggregated ownership model. It has a disaggregated usage model. Right now, those models are not informed by the price of electricity or the price of using that appliance or purchasing that appliance. But one could bring those aspects in and uh, introduce them so that one can actually do these finer grained analysis. But currently, we have not done that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So one last question, and it's also kind of very fundamental to whatever we have been saying, and partly you have answered it in answering the previous questions. But the question is which I think all the modelers are asked this question. I mean, how robust is the underlying data that you have used for prior projections? And then, do you have any recommendations for additional data that needs to be collected or published in order to better understand the residential energy demand?
Oh, yeah. I think this is a standard lament, as you said, that most modelers always have in terms of both the quality and quantity of data. Uh, about the robustness of data, I mean, essentially, it's as I said earlier, the primary source of data that we are using for appliance penetrations is the NFHS surveys that have been done that are done regularly by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So these are official data, and uh, its sampling frame and the number of sample size is actually even higher than NSSO's. So I think that is quite robust. I think the NFHS 5, because it's actually NFHS 5 is used heavily to inform health policy. So I would imagine that uh, the data there is very robust. However, uh, there are other aspects, inputs that we've used in the model, which about which I'm less sure about. So, for example, uh, even in terms of, let's say, the most fundamental thing that I talked about as to how do appliances behave in the field as against what is stuck on the label, star label. How do we don't have any information about that. There's very, very sketchy information, very little information. It's largely assumption driven. In terms of appliance sales by efficiency level, how many we might get from an industry body, how many televisions are sold, but how many 2-star TVs, how many 3-star TVs, how many 4-star TVs are sold. Uh, there is some sketchy data that the Bureau of Energy Efficiency puts out, but those are in terms of production numbers of some appliances. We don't know how that translates to sales. So there are definitely weaknesses along some of these things. And of course, this whole thing about usage of appliances. As I said in the earlier discussion, we have made some assumptions about when people turn on appliances. So, and as far as we know, there is no, shall we say, comprehensive survey that actually gathers information about some of these things to come up with broad assumptions about how we as a country use appliances, or we not as a country, of course, we are too large and too diverse to have one way of using appliances. But even if we split by state, by urban, rural, by expenditure, quintile or decile, I don't think we have any of those answers to any of those questions. And as modelers and analysts, researchers, we would of course love to have data of all these kinds. But this would essentially require us as a country to come up with more robust surveys, more robust means of collecting data, and of course making that data accessible easily to people. One model that one can think about is the model that the US has. The EIA in the US has this survey called the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, the REX, which collects fairly robust data that's representative of at the state level, if I'm not mistaken, in the US, which answers a lot of these questions. And if we have some of those things, it will definitely make our life easy. But until then, we have to live with assumptions, I'm afraid.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Ashok. I think we are at the end of our webinar. We are near the closing time. And thank you everyone for all the questions. And I think Naren and Srihari have tested their typing speed and tried to answer all your questions. But if you have any more questions, please do engage with us. Please write to us. Our report is available on our website. The link is in the chat box. And I think I really hope that everyone found this webinar useful. And I would like to thank Ashok again for all the presentation, and the entire Rumi team, the modeling team at Prayas for putting all the efforts and bringing out this insightful results. So that's all from us, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thanks.